Volume 7 C23. Queen Draudillan could have been happier. I can't believe the theocracy refused to provide an honor guard. How petty can you be? Oh, sure, you can pass through a country, but the gods forbid we should exercise some diplomatic etiquette. She stewed on that while she dipped her bread into the broth. I should have asked the Allfather for an escort just to spite the theocracy. That was a thought that kept her warm several nights in a row. The tent in which she now stewed and ate was large and round in the fashion of Draconic Kingdom royalty. Just like the rest of her kingdom, everything was extremely mobile. The rods that held the tent into place, as far as Draudillan knew, were used nowhere else in the world. Rather than separate pieces held together by rope, each one was held together by linchpins that allowed it to be folded or secured, and the tent itself was one large piece that was held into place against the rods by only a few leather strips. For furnishings, the Draconic Queen looked, by her own estimation, far more Spartan than any of her fellow royals, except for perhaps the newest royal house to appear to the west. She had a simple wardrobe which held a single enchanted gown meant for formal occasions, and the rest were clothes meant for travel, and even one enchanted for combat. Using that would not end well for me, but it's better than nothing, she thought, and drummed her fingers on the table. Even her table, while expensive, was a modular design intended to allow it to be quickly broken down and moved. It was little more than stakes secured to polished wood in enough places to hold it up, with each metal stake able to be folded up underneath the surface, which itself could then be folded in half and loaded into a wagon. A culture of retreat. The shame of it all. Draudillan despaired. All my efforts, even being willing to sleep with the disgusting monster of a man, and in the end my nation is on the brink of salvation because of a foreign ruler taking a liking to me. Though I have no idea what his letter of gratitude was about. Draudillan took a bite of bread, that at least was kept fresh and warm through magic. The flavor of the broth blended with the soft interior and the crunch of the crust was enough that she held it in her mouth rather than simply chew and swallow. And while she savored the meal, she turned her problem over and over in her head. The theocracy is as powerful as ever, but the new ruler to their north, the Allfather, makes them look like a petty tribe of goblins. The power of the kingdom of Nazarick spreads like spilled milk over a table, and I'm in their ruler's good graces. Somehow he married the Holy Queen. She muttered under her breath and glanced around. She was alone in this private space at least, with guards outside, and gave voice to her thoughts. But he's taken a different one to rule. If I had to, I suppose I could offer myself as a third. My kingdom is basically hostage to his goodwill. He has already shown a willingness to negotiate a vassal status. But what secures the most benefits? Competing with the Allmother and the Holy Queen wouldn't. No, I will not do that. She shook her head. Joining the Allfather as if I were some harem girl supplicant instead of a queen is unthinkable. The Draconic Queen set the idea aside. The assault on her royal dignity seemed ever more distasteful, regardless of all other factors at play. I will represent my domain as a peer, with dignity, and if we succeed in joining lands, it won't be that way. Her private resolve stiffened and steeled. The man's letters were all business, and as such, it was hard to find out much about him from that. Which only left her more curious at least. What will it be like to meet face to face? For that matter. The same goes for the rest. Except for a cardinal or two, Draudillan never met the royals of the other kingdoms, and as such, going to see them face to face was a first which the lonely monarch was eager to have. This train of quiet thought left her distracted in the extreme, which was why the voice seemed so distant at first. Your Majesty, you've got to run for it. We're under attack. A male voice shouted, his wild, panicked face lit up by the stones that glowed from where they hung in the tent, casting shadows about the isolated royal quarters. Attack? Beastmen, here? She cried out and shot to her feet. No, your Majesty. It's elves, he shouted. His mouth was still open when an arrow appeared in his mouth. It pierced the back of his head and came out between his teeth, shattering them and sending the little white calcium bits flying in all directions. The barbed head of the arrow lodged a handspan out of his mouth, its tip directly pointed at the queen herself. His eyes went wide with shock. He stood for a moment, his halberd fell from his hand to land with a soft thud, and for just a moment he tried to reach up and grab the arrow as if he could pull it free. He never got the chance to try. He toppled forward, his armor clattering for an instant, The cries and screams of her guards rushing to defend themselves from the enemy in the darkness was so heartrendingly familiar. Just like the attack when I was touring the front. Fear, death. The smell of blood was as thick in her nose as her thoughts were in her head. She let out a blood-curdling scream of her own in shock and rushed to her dresser. Just like almost everything, the Queen's daily wear was modular too. She yanked 2 strings at the shoulders and the whole dress fell instantly away. Got to hurry, got to hurry. What are elves doing here? Why are elves attacking us? The draconic queen wailed, enemies at home, enemies abroad, is there nowhere in the world that is safe for us? She screamed her frustration and yanked up the pants, slipped on the boots which immediately laced themselves, and flung on her shirt. Its laces secured themselves as well, and then she snatched up her enchanted dagger and ran for the exit from her tent. Outside, all was chaos. Fires rose from a dozen tents, and arrows cast shadows that vanished in an eye blink, coming out of the darkness and striking human warriors dead where they stood. The sound of ladies in waiting screaming and the noise of crying horses was matched by the voices of calm direction as those who could walk through war like common people walked through parks, gave their orders and brought order to the madness. Aim where the arrow that killed your kin came from. The stark order carried to the archers, and every time a human fell, more arrows went toward where the arrow came from. The darkness was so great outside that Draudillan couldn't see 10 feet beyond the fires, but her quick mind noticed that at least sometimes, an arrow didn't come back from the same place. We are getting a few, she thought and rushed toward her horse. Running away? Coward. She cursed herself and watched as an elven warrior came in close and began to fight with a human warrior. More and more of the long-eared warriors were making their way into her encampment. The difference between them was such that they were almost like different races of elves. Some were large, towering, muscular and broad. Others were the finer, slighter sort who looked like sprinters. Being so far away, she only heard a little about the Elf King, but his habit of raping women to produce children was widely known, and the brutish description she had, however vague, fit those larger elves to perfection. His children. If they're here. Oh gods above. No. 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 The realization struck the draconic queen with abject horror. This was no accident. They found us. They probably realized who we were. And he's after me. The assault on the slain theocracy's trump card was a story she'd heard once before, during a meeting with Cardinal Berenice over the issue of aid against the Beastmen, and in that meeting she learned that a powerful warrior was born as a result. The Cardinal's promise that humanity's trump card was far from gone meant nothing to her at that moment except to tell the Queen what was intended for her. Her feet raced over the ground, the grass bending beneath. Occasionally she jumped over a body while trying to ignore the screams that decreased in number with every passing deadly minute. An arrow whizzed past her ear, cutting off a lock of her white hair and piercing the rump of a horse. It toppled over, neighing and kicking its legs as it told the world of its pain. "Got you," a voice behind her said, and she felt a hand on her shoulder, but the Queen grabbed the dagger at her side and thrust it behind her. She felt the soft resistance of flesh, then the wetness of blood on her fingers. She lost her grip and the blade fell away. She instinctively looked back and saw the slight-looking elf staring at her with dismay on his face as he went to his knees and toppled over. "I need a horse," she cried, then shrieked as she saw the danger too late. Diving to the damp grass, a charging horse showed no care that she was even there. The rider, if he saw her, didn't recognize his queen or didn't care. An arrow pierced his throat out of the darkness, and the horse ran on without him. The cries of her people were almost gone. "I've got no way out. There's no way I can escape on foot," the Queen realized, and did the only thing she could think of. She shifted her form to be that of a child. Her enchanted clothing shifted with her, and with that, she rushed to the nearest tent, ran inside, and hid herself, holding her knees to her chest. She hugged them against herself and prayed. "Gods, please don't let him know about me. Please don't let this be how I end up. Please, protect us all." It was far too late for that. And when she heard the draw of a bow behind her, she felt another prayer go unanswered. "I know you're there. Come on out. You can't hide from my ears. I can hear you breathing." The voice of the elf was lyrical rather than cruel, and if she had to put any word to it, the Queen would have said he sounded pitying. "Damn the gods. Damn them all," the Queen thought, and raising her hands, she stood up and turned around to face her captor. Volume 7 C24. When the last of the fires began to die, the sun was beginning to rise, and the survivors of Queen Draudillen's party were herded together. The elves that were used to herd the humans together were of the larger variety. Such was their size that even without her transformation into a child-sized version of herself, the draconic queen would have had to crane her neck to look into the faces of the elves. "Move along," the elf closest to her said, and pushed her along using the curve of his bow as if he were prodding cattle along. She stumbled a little and fell against a trudging lady-in-waiting. Clad in their fine dresses as they were, they never stood a prayer of escaping. Their heads were bowed, though they darted them up now and again to glance around like deer searching for danger between drinks of water. The soldiers of Draudillen's band were one and all wounded, and none of them lightly. Their armor clinked as they were dragged by the elves or helped one another limp into place. The screams were gone, and for one brief moment, a span of time as short as the passage of the rising sun's light from one inch to the next as it went higher above the horizon, the queen thought the elves were healing the wounded, and that was why the screams stopped. That notion was erased when, as she shuffled into line with the herded women, she saw an elf shove a captured pike into the throat of a human soldier on the ground. The wet noise of it sinking into flesh and tearing open the throat, the gurgles, the noise and smell of fear, foulness, and blood made the queen grab her stomach, bend forward, and reach up her previous meal onto the grass. She coughed and spit as the acidic taste of her stomach fluids only made things worse. A puddle of brown and half-chewed meat and bread lingered under her eyes. "What about the walking wounded? Do we heal them or?" Draudillen turned to look at the source of the voice. A cluster of elves stood nearby. They were covered in dirt. A few were wounded, but the caster's glowing hands were changing that. They wore light armor, mostly flexible chainmail or banded mail, leather with metallic strips at vital places. No wonder they're so fast, she thought, and the importance of the question hit her while she continued her coughing, drowning out the clinking of chains as she and the other whimpering, crying women captives were forced together. "You know the king's orders. He has no use for men. Just make it quick," the big elf said, and a cry of alarm came up from the male captives who overheard it. They began to shout incoherently, but the clutch of elves in conversation a few paces away from the queen only drew their swords and made to walk toward the bound and wounded human warriors. "You can't," the queen thought, and then, she said it out loud. "You can't do that." They surrendered. The elf in charge, or so she assumed him to be from his orders, and from the silver tree with its multitude of branches painted on his chest, a stark contrast to those who took orders, who had progressively fewer branches on similar paintings, stopped. He gave a look down at the white-haired child and said, "I don't know who told you that, little girl, but just because someone surrenders, that doesn't mean they can't die." He laughed, as did those elves nearest to him. Draudillen's face flushed red and she shook her head. "No. They surrendered so they could live. It'd be barbaric to kill them." "A child's innocence, eh?" the towering elf said, and for a brief moment, to the queen's dismay, a hint of pity passed across his face. It became drawn, drained, and utterly weary. When it seemed he was at his lowest point, he put a hand on her head, and she immediately shook her head to cast it off. He withdrew his hand and said with a deep frown, "Child, they're the lucky ones here." He then looked to the swordsman to his left and right. "Go on, make it quick." "No!" the queen shouted, and shouted again, and yet for all her cries, they were as useless a shield for her people as their flesh was when the swords thrust down into their hearts. The captives fell with soft thuds, sent to their graves by the music of the weeping survivors, Draudillen's host of maids and ladies-in-waiting. Naive as she might have been, enough so that she felt a fresh urge to retch the already empty stomach again when she beheld the empty, disbelieving eyes of a dead young knight. Even she knew what the elf meant. And with his unstated and clear pronouncement, the captive women of the royal house lost their order. At Draudillen's back a maid fell to her knees, threw her face into her hands, and sobbed. In front of her, a maid dropped down, picked up a broken arrow and made to thrust it into her own throat, her jaw clenched, her eyes steel. "Fuck you. I'd rather die," she screamed. Her spittle flew far enough to strike one of the elven warriors as a final act of defiance. The woman's slender arms had probably never borne the weight of a sword before. The blood and filth on her black and white maid dress with its many frills was likely the dirtiest she'd ever been. Her green eyes flashed with hate where once Draudillen remembered only soft demureness and grace. Before the elves could stop her, she drew the broken wooden shaft of the arrow against her throat and shoved the jagged tip in one side and out the other. Blood fountained out of her lips as her mouth opened in a gasp of pain. The flow of red liquid spurted out over the green grass with such weight that the little blades bent in submission to her will. The maid fell to her knees before the nearest elf could reach her. She yanked the shaft free and flung it toward the elf that rushed to stop her. The useless stick struck his armor and fell to the ground, where it snapped and sank into the ground when he stepped on it. Fuck. Yuff. The crude phrase was likely something she'd only vaguely heard while listening to soul jazz, rather than in the hallowed halls of the dignified royal house. But it drove the point home, and she fell forward, her body seizing up as a caster came running over and the elf caught her at the shoulders. Queen Draudilin froze as shock swept over her at the sudden action. That was the only self-murdering act of defiance. Most became sullen, some shook and trembled, some froze stiff and stared vacantly at nothing, others wept with varying degrees of volume. The caster came near. "Come on." The queen mouthed the words, but the truth was, "I don't even know what I want to happen." She could only watch as the elven warrior lowered the corpse to the ground, and the caster gave up. "Another lucky one," he muttered, then reached into a pouch, took out a key, unlocked the woman from the line which held the others, and then stepped away. Aren't you even going to bury the dead?" The queen gasped, then fell silent as the elf glared balefully down at her. "You're dead too, you just don't know it yet." "She did though." He nudged the dead maid with his foot, briefly tapping her shoulder, then shouted his orders. "Get them moving, we need to rejoin the king as soon as possible." Draudilin stood rooted to the spot. The heavy stench of waste and fear was like a mountain on her shoulders, and when the others began to trudge, when their chains were tugged and sword tips leveled at vital organs and closed in on those who wouldn't move, she still could not bring herself to take a step. Not until the chain was yanked and the biggest elf barked out, "Move it." The queen stumbled as she was torn away from the hell of her once luxurious encampment, and she took one brief look back at it as it faded behind her. "The other monarchs will wonder where I am. The Allfather, the Holy Queen, the Frost Queen, the Reestize Queen, we were all going to go together from Kani. When I don't make it, questions will be asked. All I have to do is survive. Survive and wait for rescue." As the scene began to shrink at her back, she saw the first crows land and begin to peck at the flesh of the dead. She turned away, unable to watch further, and trudged onward the way she and the others were prodded. Volume 7 C25. The queens of 3 countries set out together the following day, the Dragonid Queen of Frost Nyabaraha, the Holy Queen Kalkabesares with her firstborn son in her arms, and the first ruling queen of Reestize Renovaself I. While all 3 carriages went together, the monarchs themselves chose to ride in the same one at the center to avoid boredom. As they rode and chatted idly, one thought was not lost on Queen Rena. A concentration of political power like this hasn't been seen in all 600 years of our history. Before that, who knows, but even in legend, I don't know of any instance of a gaggle of queens traveling together for anything. She gave voice to her thoughts after seeing the quizzical looks on the faces of her colleagues when she fell silent, and after she said it, Naya's tail twitched a little. After the dust settled, Naya said, "And I had time for other things. I started gathering stories about the past in the Abelian Hills. Their history, as it turns out, goes back quite a bit further than 600 years. However, most of it isn't written down. Instead, they have detailed oral histories scattered about the various tribes." "How is that different from just legends?" Kalka asked with a curious glance down at the twitching tail. "I wonder what it's like to have one of those. That story about the slutty lizard woman maid who had tails put to all kinds of uses." She forced the thought aside and focused on what the Dragonid had to say. "You'd think that, but no, there is a difference. The obsession with power isn't just about survival, but about being remembered." Naya explained, "All the demi-human tribes I've brought into the fold had a class within the population who were untouchable. I don't mean that in a bad way, I mean they were sacred. They're called rememberers, like a combination of storyteller and historian. And these figures would remember the greatest champions of the tribes. After I united them all, I had all these rememberers brought together at the capital, had them compare notes, and I found something interesting." "Interesting?" Rena prodded. She leaned forward without thinking about it. The genius of Reestize and her hunger for useful knowledge couldn't resist the temptation the Dragonid Queen of Frost freely offered. "Yes, All their stories more or less lined up, something that should only be possible if they preserved their tales accurately. You'd expect stories to change over time. I've seen that happen a lot. Hell, that happened to me. I was never as powerful or dangerous as I seemed, but people told stories about me that grew with time. But these were consistent, and there were a lot of demi-human tribes with a comprehensive history that goes back over 1800 years. Well beyond the recorded time with the rise of the 6 great gods. And just nobody knew this? Kalka became a little bit skeptical, her doubtful look and raised eyebrow vanishing only to caress her son's cheek when he cooed a little. As far as I can tell, no. Even in the Abelian Hills themselves, the tribes were generally not talking to each other much, except for their handful of merchants, and nobody bothered with a timeline. I managed to cobble one together from references to the positions of various stars. It's a great deal of work, but I've been having the various rememberers put together a more detailed history than anything I think any human kingdom currently has. Naya's sharp-toothed smile would have been fearsome if she hadn't appeared so self-satisfied, holding her taloned hands folded over one another in her lap with one leg crossed over the other. I'd be interested in seeing this when it's finished, Kalka and Rena said at the same moment. Naya inclined her head toward each of them in turn. It's easier to have more copies made than to write the first one. I'm having one made to present to the Allfather as a gift at the conclusion of the battle for the Empire. If he's intent on ruling demi-humans and humans alike, he should understand the forces that shaped us all. I see. Is there, or, no, are there any references to Advents in those stories? Rena asked, and at that Naya shivered. Multiples. The 6 great gods were not the first as we previously believed. Some happened among the demi-humans, and some happened far, far to the east. It makes me wonder if these things happen all over the world. Some of them, like the demon gods, are disastrous, some of the others. Naya crinkled her nose a little. There was one who was notorious just for having as much sex as possible, supposedly, and I can't confirm this. He traveled from the east over the long river and screwed his way to the other side of the ocean. Part of the folklore is that the white gleam on the water when the sun strikes it is left over from his. Never mind. The dragonid shuddered. Anyway, there were some among the demi-humans and there were others much farther away than we ever knew, every 100 to 150 years before the 6 great gods, but that's only an estimate. The ones a lot farther away, who can say? I see. That is interesting. Rena thought that over, her mind racing like mad. He did come out of nowhere. Perhaps the Allfather is one such occurrence? Reaching the mountains took less time than even Kino anticipated, with Lupu's sense of smell proving even more effective than the twins' tracking or Kino's hearing. Night after night the little party encamped, and again the vampire princess was left alone with the heroic knight. Every single time I want to tell him, I hesitate. Kino clutched the sides of her head in her hands and shook it back and forth in denial. Nerve-wracked idiot. You're not some helpless girl out of a fairy tale. You're Evil-Eye. Woman of legend. A hero among heroes. You're acting like some love-struck puppy. That was the most frustrating part about it. Shadows danced all around her as the fire reached for the distant stars. The trees were behind them now. It was the open plains before the base of the mountain. In the morning she knew they would reach the dwarf kingdom, where they planned to stay for 2 days of sightseeing and relaxing before moving on, but for now, they had the stars as their blankets and the soft grass for their beds. The swishing noise of wind over grass provided a comforting steady noise to sleep by. All was perfect. Perfect to just tell him. Just tell him and be done with it. But it wasn't that simple, and she knew it. While rumors reached her that the Allfather was slowly introducing undead labor to reduce the burden on the living who did the most dangerous work such as mining, or the most back-breaking work like farming, it was still only rumors. And while those same rumors said that vampires could live openly as long as they abided by a social contract, what would I have to sign on to for that? And could I even? Kino wondered about that. I've lived behind this mask for so long, nobody has seen my actual face for over 200 years. And that ache was a familiar one, hiding her history, her name, everything she was from those she loved best. Now here I am. Maybe this would be easier if I had never been a villain. Maybe it would be easier if my teammates knew the truth, then at least I'd have some practice coming out from behind the mask. Vampires could not shed tears of salty water. If they wept at all, their tears were red, a few drops of blood to streak their cheeks. and in hundreds of years of life, Kino recalled doing so only once. Now, every time she was near that magnificent hero and felt herself on the verge of confession, she felt the urge to weep all over again. I want him. I love him. The thought came to her each time she lay down beside her friends and pretended to sleep. She watched his chest rise and fall when he took off his armor, revealing that magnificent physique and his rugged face which was mooned over by many a young besotted dreamy-eyed girl once they saw it. He seemed to sleep so peacefully, and this occasion was no different. He grunted and groaned like any normal man at the end of a long day's travel and stretched out in his bedroll with his armor close by. Kino, as was her custom, took first watch, and though her ears sought out danger, her eyes were only on Lord Moman. Lupu was sleeping next to Gagran, and in the strangest way possible. For whatever reason, Lupu's favorite sleep position was curled up and surrounded by people. Such a strange woman. Evil Eye thought and turned an eye in that direction. Gagran's snoring should have driven the red-haired beauty mad, but if anything, Lupu seemed to enjoy the noise almost as much as she enjoyed taunting the barbarian-like mountain of a woman. Lupu's brutal tendencies weren't lost on Kino, who could smell the blood on the woman from a bowshot away or more, and it was not lost on her that no amount of violence ever seemed to trouble the cleric. A dark soul beneath a beautiful face. Evil Eye's sense of justice as a defender of humanity was nowhere near that of Lake Hughes, but even so, such casual bloodshed from a cleric was unusual. Unusual enough that she kept one eye on Moman's partner at every turn. If she's with him. And of course they do work marvelously together. Kino's troubled mind turned it all around in her head and it never failed to bring confusion, and always at the center of her thoughts was her one fixation. Lord Moman. She thought again, and inched her way along the flat stone on which she sat, drawing closer to where he lay. He was always a little bit apart from the others, not much, but it felt like the distance between a performer and his audience, just enough that each could observe and share space with the other, without getting too close. What created that distance? Has he been hurt before? Is he just afraid of injuring those who are so much weaker than he? That too was a possibility. The strongest of the strong sometimes had to struggle to keep from injuring ordinary folk, and that just made him all the more noble. She leaned over to look at his sleeping face from another angle, the square jaw and the faint beginnings of a dark beard that usually began when men ventured out into the field too long and shaved infrequently, the heavy lids that fluttered a little with his dreams. I could disappear inside those arms. She thought to herself. What you thinking about? Lupu said and stuck her head beside Evil Eye's ear to whisper in a dusky, bedroom voice. It was only battle discipline that kept the vampire from screaming in shock and leaping into a combat posture to face the smug, radiant-faced cleric. Volume 7 C26. Zesh's departure with Brain that night turned out to be more pleasant than she expected. He paid for a sack full of hardtack, dried meat, and other minor travel supplies, and they were on the road an hour after sunset. So have you really traveled as much as you say you have? Zesh asked when they were well out of sight of the town. The bright stars overhead were beautiful in their own way, their constant twinkling down from above in defiance of the darkness below was almost enchanting. Yes, I really have. Brain answered with a crooked little smile on his face. Does it seem so strange to you? Yes. Layali and Zesh answered at the same time, and at that Brain could only shrug. When you've got nothing but a dream you can carry at your side, there's nothing to hold you back, Brain said with a spring in his step. All I want is to be at the peak, and if I can't be there, I want to look at it. And how does Zesh glanced down at the little half-elf, she, fit into that? Do you usually just pick up random runaway children? Layali looked up at Brain's back. He didn't look over his shoulder that time, instead he answered as if she weren't there. I'm just dropping her off somewhere. She can travel with me to our winter, I'll kill Cerebrate, and then take her somewhere safe, and that'll be that. Layali was quiet when he said that. Somewhere like where? Zesh asked and fell into step beside him. Maybe the kingdom of Nazarick, or the kingdom of Karni. They're both peaceful places. There's got to be some place that would take in a kid too stubborn to die. Brain said it with a firm sense of admiration in his voice. We'll stop for a day or two and check out a few places on the way. Brain added, anyway, other than not wanting to get lost, since you're with us anyway, what are you hoping to see out here? I don't know. Zesh frowned. I always assumed elves were the evil ones. I never thought about it the other way around. Maybe if I see more of the world, I'll know what I'm looking for. Maybe I'll even find it at the tournament. She guessed and gave a shrug. So what were you even supposed to do there? When you win, I mean. You don't strike me as the sort to play queen. Brain asked. The road crunched underfoot where their feet met hard-packed earth, and for several seconds that was the only noise around them. Zeshi shrugged. Hand over the Baharuth Empire to the slain theocracy, I suppose. They'd put a council in charge, maybe a puppet ruler. I talked about that with Raymond sometimes. They're worried about the growing influence of the Kingdom of Nazarick with its pro-non-human stance. I guess they figure having that empire at their disposal is the best way to counter the influence of the science organ. Or whatever his name is. Isn't that like a secret or something? Brain cocked his head at her as she spilled out the secret as if it were a discussion about the weather. Do I look like I pay attention to that sort of nonsense? Zeshi asked with yet another indifferent shrug. I guess not. Brain matched her shrug for shrug. The chatter was amiable to the point of nonsense until the sun began to rise and they reached a bend in the long river. We're near Ikari City, the farthest northern city of the slain theocracy. Brain explained and pointed across the river. A stone bridge wide enough for 6 men to pass abreast lay minutes walk away. If it were just me, I'd stop in the city, but since you and Layali are here, I recommend we bypass it. If you think it's best, you're the guide, but if we have time, I'd really like to see it, Zeshi said. The city wasn't visible from where they stood, but she looked where he pointed anyway. We can just hide my and Layali's ears to be safe, and I promise I won't cause trouble. I just want to see. Brain scratched his head and looked behind him to where Layali stood. The small half-elf was shivering as if she were cold. You're not going to get rid of me, are you? Brain? If we go there, I mean. Not going to. Not going to sell me, are you? I'm carrying your bag, just like you said. She held up the little sack of food that he'd given her to carry as her job after leaving the inn. It swayed a little as if pushed by the breeze. The blue-haired swordsman crouched down and looked at her little trembling face. With both her eyes intact, she was a pretty young thing, and it was hard not to be moved to pity. No. No, I'm not. He answered her and put a hand on her head. You're a good porter, and I told you, you can stay with me till Cerebrate is dead. That was the deal, and Brain Unglaeus always keeps his deals. He tousled her hair and she settled down, expelling a sigh at his reassurance. He pulled the hood up over her head. We'll make camp here for now, then resume this evening. He looked back over toward the older half-elf. Zeshi, time to earn your keep. Let me show you how to make camp. And Layali, why don't you get the bedrolls laid out, then I'll catch some fish for us. After that, maybe you can show me something else I've never seen before. That arena match looks a lot less certain now, and I'd rather not die if I can avoid it. Zeshi snorted. I'll show you what I know. But we're both fighting in it, so you'll face me again. Aren't you worried I might kill you then? Brain paused mid-step away and turned to look at the half-elf. He held a hand up to his mouth and yawned. Are you really going to fight for the theocracy still? That gave Zeshi pause. And while she paused, Brain went on. I might die, but then, you might be the only one there who can beat me, and after what you're going to see in Ikari City, I don't think you'll feel like fighting for the theocracy. But even if you do, if you show me the peak, I'll surrender. I don't think you'll kill me without a reason, and I'll wager the peak on that. What in the world is he expecting me to see there? Was the only thing Zeshi could wonder while he and Layali began to direct her on how to make a campsite. Queen Draudillan stood shivering in line. Arriving at the encampment of their captors, any doubts about who was behind the attack on her party were wiped away by the first handmaiden's scream when she was taken within the tent. She stood in the same long line as the others. Their chains bound them together so that none could run without the others, and elven bows, spears, and swords promised to make that impossible. A woman's chains were undone, and then a pair of towering behemoths of elven males each grabbed her at the biceps. She kicked. Her scream pierced the air. No. No. Don't. Take your hands off me. Please. The maid shrieked as she was bodily carried toward the golden tent and then thrown through the flap. The elves who hauled her along looked vaguely disgusted, but a sense of relief was about them at the same time. They moved like golems, hollow and soulless, mechanically moving but not really understanding the meaning of what they did. There's no way they don't know, the queen told herself as she took another step forward. Inside the tent, the steady slapping of flesh against flesh was audible between the woman's long screams. No. Take your hands. Play no arg. It hurts. It hurts. The woman screamed within. None of the ones before her emerged, and none of the ones to go in made any audible sound that the queen could hear. Are they even alive? She wondered. This time she was close enough to hear the Elf King's vicious and brutish grunt of satisfaction, and the woman within, one of Draudilin's many attendants, was as silent as the grave, just like the others. There were 8 more in front of her, and the elves who guarded the tent entrance seemed to know what the silence within meant. They approached and grabbed the next woman in line, and the shrieking futile pleas began again. A nightmarish assembly line which produced weeping, silence, and shame continued until at last Draudilin found herself the only one remaining. Her body was sweating enough to turn the fresh sea salty. No. Me too. A part of her was ashamed of her selfish thought after having borne even distant witness to the suffering of her surviving people and the deaths of her small band of escorting warriors, and yet at that moment the overwhelming thought was a fear for herself, shame or no shame. The pair of elves stood at her shoulders and traded a glance at one another. A child? One said to the other. He said all, and it's this one or my daughter. Sorry. Little girl, this isn't a choice, this is a lack of options. The behemoth muttered, and prompted by his words, the other elf began to work the manacles as well. The metal clinked and fell away, and Draudilin immediately attempted to run. Her muscles tensed, her feet sprang forward, and she shrieked, her arms outstretched, her face red, free of any chains or impediments. For the first moment since her capture, she made a break for it. I can't go in there. I can't go in there. She wailed in her head. But before she made it even 2 steps she felt the heavy body of an elf on top of her. She fell with a thud to the ground, the wind knocked out of her and his great weight on top of her small body. She began coughing and heaving, choked half-sobs coming out of her mouth. The tight muscles of the powerful elf clung around her body like ropes of flesh. Just stop struggling. It'll be easier. He grunted and picked her bodily up. She was not walked like the others, but carried. Her feet kicked at his iron-like abdominal muscles. She sank her teeth into his arm, and though he grunted when her teeth left their mark on his flesh, he refused to release her. She scratched and clawed and bucked against him, arching her back, trying to push herself free. You're going to have to kill me, she howled, and then he proved her words a lie when he simply tossed her in through the tent flap. The fabric caressed her skin like a lover before she flew past and landed with another thud on the ground just inside the tent. She tumbled over and over, and could feel the promise of future bruises where she hit until she came to a stop and found herself staring up at an elf almost twice the size of any of the others. A mountain of lightly tanned flesh and blonde hair that tumbled down his back, supreme arrogance on his face in the form of a sneer that she doubted ever left him. The whole tent stank of sex, and now within, she could hear faint moans from those who entered it before her. They lay curled up on their sides, tattered remnants of once good clothing scattered about the royal's private space, and those whom he had brought to him now wore only tears and flesh. Bruises were obvious where he'd beaten them more recalcitrant into submission, and they either looked at nothing with now vacant, hollow eyes, or they looked at their queen with pity. None had the strength to properly move. The king of the elves reached down and grabbed Draudilin's hair at the base of her skull and picked her up so that she was hung by her hair several feet off the ground. She howled and kicked and swung, struggling to free herself. Let me go. Let me go. The queen shrieked, but the elf king, naked though he was, showed no sign of desire that was obvious in naked men, nor did he seem to care or even notice the pain in the queen's eyes, nor did he seem to hear her words. A child? I can't breed you, he snapped and dropped her at his feet. She fell in a heap and clutched at her skull. Useless. Useless servants. He cursed and began to mutter something in a quiet fury. I might as well dispose of you, he said and balled up a fist. By the gods, this is it. The queen thought and looked up with horror as he struck a monk's combat stance with one foot back. Wait. A voice cried out. The elf king, not used to being interrupted, stopped his swing and looked over at one of his new playthings. You interrupt. I should kill you for that, he spat, literally, and the spittle struck the woman's cheek and began to run down her skin over the red mark where he'd slapped her at the start of his use of her. She's the daughter of Queen Draudilin, on her way to join her mother at the tournament. You can trade her for time with the Draconic Queen. The Draconic Queen is the granddaughter of a dragon lord. She might give you what you want. The servant cried out, Her white-green eyes darted between the white-haired queen in disguise and the towering naked king of the elves, and it worked enough to give their captor pause. Someone like that. Forget time, it will give me the chance to capture someone powerful. Someone who might give me a useful set of brats. He thought, and lowered his fist. I don't care to keep useless whelps around. He muttered. It wasn't quite an argument, but it was something of an objection. Hostages aren't useless, O King of Elves. And she can help look after everybody. She can work. The servant objected, and the king lowered his fist the rest of the way. His combat stance ended a moment later. I suppose. He leveled a finger at Draudillan. Go, fetch some water, and help my new toys survive. It's a long trip the rest of the way. Don't make me speak to you again, understood? The elf king growled down at her, and Draudillan bowed her head and nodded, then slowly rose to her feet, and scurried for the tent flap as fast as her legs could carry her. If we survive this, that woman, she will be given the highest honors I can give to any hero in my kingdom. The queen thought, and prayed to the gods that she would not hear the sound of flesh slapping flesh again as she was made to obey. And again her prayers went unanswered.